Hey guys, it's Courtney here. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free, and there are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast from your phone or computer. Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcast. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's literally everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to Anchor FM to get started.
Welcome to the Black Standard Podcast. The Black Standard Podcast is an Afrocentric, Pan-African show that aims to normalize Black finance and wealth. And we share useful information on African history, current and global affairs, entrepreneurship, business, and Black culture and achievements. If you're looking to discover your roots while learning about the greatness hidden in the African race, or if you're from another race and you're interested in learning about our culture, then this podcast is perfect for you. Here at the Black Standard Podcast, we are all about raising the bar and setting the standard. Here is your host, Courtney Ann Wallace.
Hello, my beautiful audience. Welcome back to the Black Standard Podcast. This is episode 9 of the podcast, and it's just me and you today. That's right, we have no guests. Happy World Ocean Day, everyone. If you are a climate activist, or even if you're not a climate activist, today is a day where we bring awareness to our marine life, our coral reefs or little fishies. And I just want to put it out there, the next time you go to the beach, put the bottle in the trash. It affects our coral reefs, plastic getting into the oceans and our fish mistaking it for food, and then they die of malnutrition, all of that, which in turn we end up consuming, in case you didn't realize, and that's not good for us either. So let's be mindful of our oceans today and every day. It's time for our daily mantra. So as you guys know, this is something we do every episode. If you're a part of the Black Standard family, you guys should know this by heart by now. But for our new listeners, our daily mantra is, I am happy to be alive. My heart is clean, my mind is open, and I am ready to receive. So we're going to repeat this. Hopefully you caught all of that. I am happy to be alive. My heart is clean. My mind is open. I am ready to receive. All right? So let's get into this episode. Our quote of the day is, wealth consists not having in great possessions, but having few wants. And this is by Epictetus. Don't get me for that pronunciation, guys. Y'all know that was a difficult word. Don't judge me. Anyways, guys, today we have to talk about something really important. We're going to be talking about the influence of trade on the Black community. Now, as you guys know, this is a Pan-African podcast. I mean, you can tell by the name, the Black Standard Podcast. And I always try to educate you guys as best as I can. And so today we're going to be diving into some economics and talk about how trade has influenced the Black community. Okay? So in a previous episode, I spoke about the influence of the Black dollar, where I highlighted that although we have, such a high income pool, it's not retained inside our communities. So in other words, we contribute so much, but we receive so little. So with that episode, I thought it was best to backtrack into history a little bit and show you guys how we got here in the first place. So if you're not familiar with the Atlantic slave trade, it was a system in slavery where Africa provided the Americas with approximately 10 million slaves. I mean, 10 million is a lot, but basically they go there, they work on plantations, and then these crops are exported to Europe. Some of these crops were sugarcane, cotton, and tobacco. And then in turn, Europe would supply Africa with guns, cloth, and cowries, which are like some little seashells, as payment for more slaves to be sent to Europe. So it was a network, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? Between the 1680s and the 1780s, the value of Africa's Atlantic slave trade, it rose sixfold. It was at the peak of its trade and it was worth 47 million euros. All right. Now, I'm going to read an excerpt from BBC Co UK, and I'll actually leave the link to all of these resources used for this episode in the description box below. So the excerpt says, African rulers exchanged captives for guns. Rulers were in competition with each other, and so the acquisition of guns provided an edge over their rivals. This increased their drive to capture and sell slaves, and the new availability of guns was a direct consequence of the slave trade. So, the mass importation of guns for slaves actually altered the conduct of warfare in Africa and changed the balance of power between kingdoms overall. At the height of the Atlantic slave trade, it only states that, only states that were equipped with guns were able to resist attacks from their neighbors. And so the demand for slaves combined with the supply of guns encouraged rulers to attack other villages or their neighbors, so to speak. So warfare became more attractive to those that might easily profit from it, and so war created captives and thus potential slaves to profit from. Wars were not usually fought just for captives, but the temptation to go to war obviously increased. As the demand for slaves grew, in some areas the impact actually destabilized existing kingdoms. Existing systems of governance based on kinship and consent were destroyed. In new kingdoms such as Dahomey, which was established around 1600, raiding for slaves became a way of life for the armed elite. And so frequent slave raiding meant it became harder to distinguish insiders from outsiders. And then ethnic boundaries were all chewed up and spat out to the side. So in other words, guys, initially when the whole slave trade started, it was usually, prisoners, the what lefts of society that they would trade. But then with the supply of guns, them wanting more guns, they actually were tempted to sell other people, and that's exactly what happened. And so a lot of systems were destabilized and a lot of persons were like, I don't know who is who. I don't trust nobody. You get what I'm saying? So the article was basically expressing that it got to a point where any little thing would cause you to be cast into slavery, such as being guilty of a crime, paying a debt because your family owes someone, being tricked by a friend or a loved one, or, as I mentioned before, being a prisoner from a war. Now, some villages even began to prey on other villages so that they could acquire guns to protect their villages from raids. You see how messed up that is? So the trade had gotten so popular that persons who didn't want to be slaves started selling slaves so that they could have guns to protect themselves from being slaves. Now, with that said, the women in Africa fell under quite a generous amount of pressure because all of the men were being taken and sold. And so in total, an estimated of 12.5 million persons were taken from Africa and sent to the Americas and the Caribbean region. Mind you, this does not count the persons who fought back, those who died because they were sick, or, those who were killed in the process and left on the shores of Africa. And slaves often traveled on foot in coffles, lines of captives, shackled and bound together. So it's possible that there were many more millions who died during raiding and transporting. If you think this was the only thing that disrupted the African system by the arrival of Europeans, think again. So let me just be clear. This mass removal of persons, it did result in communities, families, and societies being left in shambles. But some states or countries in Africa were especially left severely underpopulated, which I suspect to be the reason of the economic turmoil today in some of the African countries. Because if you notice, Africa has a weird ratio of wealth generation. There are some countries that are extremely rich, and then there are some countries that are extremely poor. Additionally, the Europeans didn't just bring them guns to feed violence. They brought diseases, STDs, and also STIs. I mean, what's ironic is while the Africans thought they were making a deal, if you really look at the bigger picture, if you're paying attention, Africa's societal and economic situation was negatively affected, you know what I mean? While all those exports going to Europe caused the continent to grow and flourish, which empowered them to expand their operations. Like, that's so messed up. And then it caused reallocation of resources of African economies, and then they became so dependent on raiding just to make a living. Now, raiding, it constrained the economic development of African states. It encouraged ethnic and social division because, as I mentioned, villages started raiding other villages, and it provoked a culture of political violence and disregard for human life, and it also created widespread attitudes of racism and contempt for Africans. Okay, now I have another article here by Vox EU CEPR, and then it's gonna basically break down the theoretical side of why Africa is one of the largest continents, but actually the poorest continent. So it says an alternative interpretation of the relationship is that the parts of Africa from which the largest number of slaves were taken were initially the most underdeveloped. Today, because those characteristics persist, these parts of Africa continue to be underdeveloped and poor. I also tested this alternative hypothesis by checking whether it was in fact the initially least developed parts of Africa that engaged the most heavily in slave trades. I find that the data suggests that, if anything, it was the parts of Africa that were initially the most developed, not least developed, that supplied the largest number of slaves. In the analysis, I also used a statistical technique called instrumental variables, which is an estimation to identify the causal effect of the slave trade on economic development. The findings from the instrumental variables estimates suggested that increased extraction during the slave trades did indeed cause worse economic performance. My estimates in Nunn 2008, which is a reference he used for the article, it allowed for the first time the impacts the slave trades had on economic development to be understood quantitatively. In particular, using the estimates, one is now able to calculate how much more developed Africa would be or would have been if the slave trades had not taken place. These calculations were undertaken in Nunn 2010. And as an initial setup of the calculation, we must first note that the mean level of average per capita income of the countries in Africa is $1,834. This was measured in the year 2000. Now, this is significantly lower than the income for the rest of the world. Y'all want to know what the income for the rest of the world is? $8,809. And it's still much lower than the income of developing countries, which is $4,868. So where a developing country is defined as one with less than $14,000 per capita income, Africa, it wasn't even near a developing country, child. Now, according to the estimates from Nunn, which again is the same reference, if the slave trades had not occurred, then 72% of the average income gap between Africa and the rest of the world would not exist today. And 99% of the income gap between Africa and other developing countries would not exist. In other words, had the slave trades not occurred, Africa would not be the most underdeveloped region of the world, and it would have a similar level of development to Latin America or Asia. Y'all heard that? Were you guys listening to that? We have no idea of the scope of how the slave trade affected us. And I don't think a lot of us took the time out to research. And I've spoken about this in other episodes as well. even after slavery, the African diaspora suffered. Even when slavery was abolished, we weren't allowed to own businesses. We weren't allowed to vote. We weren't allowed to own land. We weren't even allowed to freaking marry. And you guys think that all of that hasn't impacted us for so many years to this day? I'm not saying it's irreparable. I'm saying that we have a lot of work to be done. This is why I try my best to bring people on here to show you the possibilities, because it is your responsibility to rectify what was done to us. And it is our responsibility to change the narrative for our children and for our children's children. Okay? So, what are your thoughts on today's episode? If you guys listen to this to the very end, leave a review, whether good or bad, so I can best formulate more content like this for you, okay? And guys, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have been uploading the full length of our guest interviews over on YouTube, and we're gonna start publishing additional content soon so that you can be educated financially, historically, all of that. Now, if you're listening on Apple Podcast, don't forget to rate this podcast, as it helps our podcast tremendously, okay? But guys, it was hard to make this episode. I'll be quite honest with you, but it was also beneficial because you don't know where you're going. Like I've always said, if you don't know where you're coming from. All right, guys, that is a wrap. I will see you guys in next week's episode. Okay, take care of yourself, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you for tuning in to the Black Standard Podcast. Follow us on social media and join the community. You can find us on Instagram at the Black Standard _JA, Facebook at the Black Standard JA, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find the recorded version of our podcast along with additional content. Until our next episode, see you soon.